what is that smell? I am definitely getting a hint of a deal. Oh wait, it's more than a hint. Yeah, these are the best deals, and not just this season, but all year long. In all seriousness, the smartest shoppers know that you get the brands you love with the most savings and cash back with Rakuten. And I know I'm certainly interested in sniffing out those deals. Start getting cash back at your favorite stores like Urban Outfitters, Petco, even Expedia, and getting cash back doesn't mean you have to miss out on sales because those can be stacked right on top. It's easy to use and based on a simple idea. Stores pay Rakuten for sending them shoppers, and Rakuten shares the money with you as cashback through PayPal or check. Smells like a perfect deal to me. Download the free Rakuten app and never miss a deal. Or go to Rakuten.com to start getting the most bang for your buck. That's Rakuten.
I was never really a runner. The way I see running is a gift, especially when you have stage 4 cancer. I'm Anne. I'm running the Boston Marathon, presented by Bank of America. I run for Dana-Farber Cancer Institute to give people like me a chance to thrive in life, even with cancer.
Join Bank of America in helping Anne's cause. Give if you can at BofA.com/supportAnne. What would you like the power to do? References to charitable organizations is not an endorsement by Bank of America Corporation. Copyright 2025.
Hello, and welcome to Canadian Heritage Minutes. And that's minutes with bracket S, so as to not impede on the trademark of the actual Canadian Heritage Minutes, the beloved television commercials by Historica Canada. My name is Anne Foster, and this is a spin-off podcast of my regular podcast, Vulgar History. So on Vulgar History, I tell the stories of scandalous women from history, and I hadn't done a lot of Canadian women in history, and it just occurred to me, I just had this huge, Oprah trademark aha moment where I was like, oh shit, I kind of understand why now I haven't talked about women in Canadian history until now. So I often, and you might often see this too, when people are advertising their history books or podcasts or documentaries, they're like, this isn't boring history like you learned in school. Like, did you hate history in school? You won't hate this podcast. And I'm like, every time I see one of those ads, I'm like, who hated history in school? Like, I've always loved history. Like as a kid, I loved reading about Pompeii and ancient Egypt and ancient Rome, Henry VIII and his wives. Like I've always been really hype about history. So don't understand people who didn't like it until all the stuff that's been happening in Canada recently. And I was like, I want to delve into Canadian history, talk about Canadian history more on my podcast. And I was like, why haven't I talked more about Canadian history on Vulgar History? And I was like, oh, because it's boring is my immediate instinctive response. And I'm like, oh, that's what people are talking about. Like the way that I was personally taught Canadian history, no shade to the specific teachers, but it's like the curriculum was just kind of like fur trade, documents being signed, Fathers of Confederation, and then you jump into the 20th century and it's like World War II. Like it was not of interest to me at the time, because I didn't know then the terminology I know now, which is like my interest is in social history, which means the history of people's everyday lives and their feelings and what they were doing, and not military battles and not the fur trade, but like who are the people there? And especially women's stories are of interest to me. And so when I delved into this project to look about Canadian women from history, I asked my mother, who is from New Brunswick, and she, just off the top of her head, she was like, oh, well, there's Madame Latour. And she kind of only vaguely remembered who that was, but she remembers hearing about her, probably learning about her in school, maybe a little field trip to St. John. And what she remembered is that Madame Latour is somebody who defended a house or a fortress or something from someone she couldn't quite remember. And so I looked up the story and I'm like, oh, this is a good story. This is actually exactly the sort of story that I got really excited about. And so here we are, sharing the story here on Canadian Heritage Minutes. And I do just want, before we get into the story, to give a brief political statement, which I was actually, if you're listening to this podcast, you're a cool person. Like, you made the decision to listen to a feminist women's history Canadian podcast, and that speaks well of you. And I got my first, I talk about history from all around the world on Vulgar History. And thus far, the only criticisms that I've received in 5 years of doing that podcast of people feeling like you're not being appropriately respectful were from Americans who didn't like the way that I was like saying mean things about Thomas Jefferson or something. And so I got my first complaint from a Canadian about one of these episodes, and it wasn't even for the history story I was telling. It was because I was speaking out against the goddamn Conservative Party of Canada. And I will, if you're listening to this podcast, if you listen to my regular podcast, it's pretty apparent in every episode what my politics are. I'm somebody who supports safe injection sites. I support the trans community, the queer community, gay marriage. I support finding social structures that can help people get out of homelessness, like supporting people who have drug addiction. All of these things are important to me. Like, I'm anti-racist. Like, I support DEI initiatives. I am one of those woke people you hear about. That's my politics. And that's why I support anyone other than the Conservative Party of Canada who have proven themselves. Like, first of all, Pierre Poilievre I saw him described as like two slogans in a trench coat. Like, he has no personality, thank God, because if that party was being led by somebody with actual charisma, I don't know, maybe they would be even more popular than they are now. But his whole thing is he's just kind of pandering to all the shitty opinions that people get really riled up about. He's like anti-abortion. He's anti like trans people. He's like anti like everything that I stand for, he and that party are against. And that is why I'm against that party. So if you support that party, you do you, boo. But like, if you share any of the same opinions as I do, then you should really vote for somebody else. And in this election, that really looks like the Liberal Party is kind of the best place to throw your vote, unless you're in one of these like ridings where the Liberals have no chance, like where I am in Saskatoon, in which case vote for the NDP. Or in Quebec, vote for Bloc Québécois. So that's my political advice. And if you want to see, am I in one of those ridings where you should vote NDP instead of Liberal, like go to the website smartvoting.ca, put in your postal code, and it can show you kind of the latest polling numbers and how best to vote so that there's not a vote split that lets this creepy-ass Pierre, who used to wear glasses and now doesn't wear glasses and looks so much like a guy who should just be wearing glasses. And that annoys me. Like, we just gotta rein this guy in. Anyway, today's story is about New Brunswick, which is, to people who don't know about Canada, or even people who of Western Canada who don't know about East Coast Canada. I'm originally from Nova Scotia, and so I know very well where those provinces are. I don't know a lot of other geography about anywhere else in the world, but what I do know is the placement of all of the provinces in the Atlantic region. And I say Atlantic region because here's a story. So sometimes people use the phrases Maritimes and Atlantic region interchangeably, which is incorrect. When I was going to university, there were a number of people in my class from Newfoundland, and they made it very clear. Newfoundland, the province, is part of the Atlantic region, but it is not part of the Maritimes. The Maritimes is Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island. And New Brunswick just kind of doesn't get a lot of attention. Sometimes it's seen as kind of like you have to drive through it to get from Quebec to Nova Scotia, or PEI. My mother's from New Brunswick. She's from Bathurst, New Brunswick. Shout out to Bathurst. And there's so much history in New Brunswick. Like, first of all, starting with the fact that New Brunswick is on the traditional unceded territory of the Wolastoqiyik Maliseet, and also is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which Wolastoqiyik Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1726. So that is a history of, like, there's been people living there for ages, and that's because there's like really good farming land there, and it's just a good place to kind of set up a city. And when the French colonists came over, that's kind of where they set up shop in the first place. Later, after the American Revolution, if you watched Outlander, do you remember when Outlander, which is what I call the man, the red-haired man, he and his wife, they came over from the Highlands of Scotland to America to fight in the American Revolution? That was my ancestors on my mother's side. They came over from the Highlands of Scotland to fight in the American Revolution. On the redcoat side, when they lost, they were called the Loyalists because they were loyal to the British Crown. They went up to New Brunswick, and that is where my mother's family's ancestors were from. But before they were there, the French were there for quite a while, and that is the era we're talking about. And that is the story where the story of Madame Latour takes place. So Françoise-Marie Jacquelin, aka Madame Latour. And the information that I got about her is from Wikipedia, which had a pretty solid entry about her, as well as an entry in the Canadian Encyclopedia. John Wood's blog, the Parks Canada website, and the Dictionary of Canadian Biography. So she's totally iconic. You have to stan. And I did mention like that the Indigenous people who were in this area before the French showed up and were still there when the French showed up. They're not really in this story. This is a story of white on white violence. And you might expect it's going to be a story of French on British or British on French violence, but it's actually French on French violence. So Madame Latour, whose name, like we're going to call her Jacqueline, Françoise-Marie Jacquelin. We'll call her Jacqueline. She was born and baptized on July 18th, 1621 in Nogent-le-Rotrou in northern France. Yes, she was from France. So this is the time period where France was sending people from France over into these new colonies that they were starting up on the east coast of Canada. It's kind of like, if you remember when, just because a lot of people listening to this maybe are American or familiar with American history, like, you know, the Puritans came over from England to North America, but they were like still the subjects of the English king. And then eventually, you know, American Revolution, etc., they became their own country. So at this point, the French colonies in North America were very much just like Le Petit France. Like they were still cool with the French king. Like people were going back and forth a lot between France and then what they call New France. Eventually, like within a few generations, the communities that were developing in the east coast of Canada would develop their own culture separate from France. And those are the Acadians. But that's still in the future of this. Like this is still, people were very much just like French from France was their vibe. And she was literally in France. She was born in France. She was the daughter of Jacques Jacquelin, amazing name, who was a medical doctor, and Hélène Lerminier. And so when she was 18 years old in 1640, she married Charles de Saint-Étienne de la Tour. Who is this? Charles de Saint-Étienne de la Tour was also born in France in 1593. When he was 17 years old, he joined a ship that was going over to Port Royal in Acadia. So again, I said they're not the Acadians yet, but it was called Acadia, the name of the colony. So Port Royal was one of the French settlements in the east coast of Canada. And 17-year-old Charles, along with his father, went in an expedition led by Jean de Biencourt de Poutrincourt. You know, this whole Canadian solidarity, patriotism thing has really got me unearthing my love of speaking in French, or just saying French names in a French way. So the leader of this expedition was Jean de Biencourt de Poutrincourt, which reminds me of Lestat de Liancourt. Anyway, also along this trip was another teenager, the son of Jean, who is also called Charles, just to make this all confusing. So it's like two dads and their sons, both called Charles. So this expedition also included a Catholic priest, and his job was to baptize the local Mi'kmaq people, including their chief, Membertou. This habitation that they went to, Port Royal, had been previously abandoned due to financial troubles. So, 1613, the habitation at Port Royal was attacked by Virginia colonists. America versus Canada that's been a vibe since moment one. Like Virginia colonists, I'm just picturing the like nightmare white people from the Disney movie Pocahontas, the Virginia colony, those guys. So they were led by Captain Samuel Argall. Several settlers were killed, others taken prisoner, and the fort and goods were destroyed. Expedition leader Poutrincourt, the dad of other Charles, he had gone back to France for the winter to gather supplies. So he kind of like dropped off the expedition and then he pieced up back to France. And when he returned to New France in the spring, he was just like, what the fuck happened here? So he then returned to France with the surviving settlers. And he was just like, you know what, New France, that's not my thing anymore. I'm out. And so he left his interest in the colony to his son, Charles. So Charles Poutrincourt, who is now, I guess, now he's 20. He remained, and so did the now 18-year-old Charles de la Tour. So they were living there amongst the Mi'kmaq and engaging in the fur industry. Now, I do realize I said earlier that the Indigenous people are not part of this story. They're part of this part of the story. Madame de la Tour is not there yet. Her story is going to be white on white violence. So stay tuned. Charles Poutrincourt died in 1623. Very sad. He's very young, but also for the story, helps out because now there's only one person called Charles left in the story. And so he left as his heir Latour, Charles de Latour, who is like a year younger than him and not related to him, but he was they were pals, and he's just like, this, I trust you to be in charge of this habitation now. But this was like informal, and it was not recognized by the French crown because the habitation was like technically belonged to the French king, who at this point was Louis, I want to say 13th, not the Sun King, the one before. So Latour, Charles Latour, took charge of the colony. He's like 21 years old. So he took charge of the colony, and he decided to migrate from Port Royal to Cap-le Sable, present-day Port Latour, Nova Scotia. So he's in charge of the colony, and I guess what this means is just like the colony involved several different places. And so he moved from one part of the colony to another part of the colony. Where he moved, he built a strong fortress called Fort Lomeron in honor of his friend David Lomeron. Soon after, Charles Latour married a woman from the Mi'kmaq tribe and started a family with her. What is her name? We don't know. Then there was the Anglo-French War of 1627, which is just like British versus French over the territory of these colonies. So he knew he had to strengthen his defenses in order to keep this colony French. So he wrote letters to, I was right, King Louis XIII. He wrote letters to King Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu, who's the guy from the Three Musketeers books, requesting supplies and reinforcements, as well as a proper commission authorizing him to defend the area. Because remember, he was in charge because his dead friend had said he could be, but the king had never actually said, you're in charge, Charles. Reinforcements were sent in the spring of 1628. However, the ships were captured by the English, and the crew, including his dad, who was part of this reinforcements squad, were sent as prisoners to England. And then Quebec, which was another French colony, fell to the English in 1629. So the only French stronghold left in New France was Fort Lomeron, which was overseen unofficially, I guess, by Charles Latour. After he was captured, Charles's dad made an alliance with the English and promised to win over his son in exchange for the English making him, the dad, a baronet of Nova Scotia and a large grant of land. So his dad, I guess, was released and came over, and he's like, hey, you should really surrender to the English. They're actually okay people. He refused. Charles refused, stating he would rather die than betray his king. And after Charles refused, his dad led English troops. His dad led English troops in an unsuccessful attack on Fort Lomeron. Finally, 1631, Charles Latour was formally granted a commission by King Louis XIII, naming him lieutenant governor and governor of Acadia, which is the name of the whole area of all the colonies. So he relocated to the mouth of the St. John River in present-day St. John, New Brunswick, where he built a new fort called Fort Ste. Marie. Later is named after him, Fort Latour. The following year, there was a treaty that meant that all the lands that had been seized by the British were returned to France, including Acadia. In addition, Cardinal Richelieu, again, is this not the villain from the Three Musketeers book? Sent his cousin, Isaac de Razilly, as the new lieutenant governor of all of New France and governor of Acadia, which conflicted with Charles Latour's commission from the prior year. So they've both been told they're in charge, but they can't both be in charge, so this is going to be problematic. Initially, Charles Latour and Razilly agreed to divide control of Acadia. So Razilly would control Le Havre, Port Royal, and the St. Croix area, while Latour was given authority over Cap de Sable and the St. John River, and he would be headquartered at Fort Ste. Marie. Then Razilly unexpectedly died. I'm going to guess some sort of illness, but you know what? Maybe he was poisoned. It's that kind of story. And the amicable relationship these two shared did not extend to his successor, Charles de Menu d'Aulnay. So, I'm just going to say, these two were getting along and things are cool, and then the successor, Charles de Menu d'Aulnay, did not get along, so it's like, what did Razilly die of? I don't know, but if I was investigating, I would look at Charles de Menu d'Aulnay, because he came in and he had a lot to gain from this. Charles Latour had a lot to lose. So, 1639, Charles de Latour's Mi'kmaq wife, again name unknown, died, and he was left with 3 daughters. He needed a male heir to bolster his claim to be the governor in charge of Acadia. So he set about contracting for a new wife, which is how you got a wife in those times. And then, I don't know, his scouts or somebody or a friend of a friend was like, oh, hey, I know a cool person. And the person he chose was our heroine, 18-year-old Françoise-Marie Jacquelin back in France. So this was like, great, let's do it up. Let's get these two people married. Let's send her from France to New France. So there was a marriage contract done up, which authorized Jacqueline to keep all her property and anything that she might inherit. She was entitled to a half share of anything she or her husband acquired during their marriage. And as a widow, she would be entitled to half her husband's estate with an inheritance fund, and she would be the guardian of any children. This is a solid marriage contract. She had a good lawyer. So she arrived in Port Royal June 1640, got married to Charles de la Tour, and they moved to Fort Ste. Marie, and she gave birth to a son, presumably 9 months later. And then she turns from Jacqueline into Action Jacqueline. So July 1640, Charles de la Tour and his nemesis, Charles de Manu d'Aulnay, began a series of violent and costly confrontations that would last for the next 5 years. 5 years, just Charles, it's not just white on white violence, it's Charles on Charles violence. And it's because both of them had been told that they could be in charge of this whole area, which was like a prestigious job. They got a lot of money. They had both been told that they could be in charge. They could not both be in charge. They could not work together. So 5 years of war, apparently. Hostilities continued to escalate. In 1642, d'Aulnay managed to, because of his friends in important places, like I guess Cardinal Richelieu, got Charles de la Tour charged with treason and disrespect to the French crown. So this meant Charles de la Tour knew that if he was to return to France, he would be imprisoned. So instead, he sent his wife, Action Jacqueline, to France to plead his case to the king, she's like in her early 20s. Like the amount of faith he put in her really speaks to how convincing he knew she would be, how kind of tough he knew she could be, how strong and how well-spoken. So we don't know a lot about Jacqueline, but like the fact that he sent her just gives us a clue of how much he relied on her and how she was kind of pretty great. So she headed out on a ship. d'Aulnay was already doing a blockade of the St. John River. Like he had his ships there hoping to catch somebody leaving, but she evaded them. Her in combination with the person driving her ship, which was presumably not her, but maybe it was her. She made her way to France, and she successfully appealed against the king's order that her husband be arrested and brought to France on charges of disloyalty. Like she talked their way out of this. Like she went over there, a woman like in her early 20s from this like small village in France, and they were like, you know what, great points. I get it. And we agree with you. In fact, Jacqueline was given permission to return to Acadia with a warship filled with supplies for Fort La Tour at St. John Harbor. What did she say? Like, amazing negotiation. This is why she was sent, because he knew that she could do this. Maybe this is why she was chosen as the wife. They're just like, this is who you need to marry. Like, this is who you want on your side. And now for a quick advertising break. And we're back. So things were cool there for a while. 2 years later, she sailed again to France, but d'Aulnay had been scheming, and this time she found that Charles was again completely discredited at court owing to the charges brought by d'Aulnay. So despite the fact that she herself was forbidden to leave France, like she wasn't allowed to return because I guess that was part of this whole shenanigans, Jacqueline borrowed money from friends and escaped to England. Like this action hero, Jacqueline, she escaped to England, where she bought supplies and chartered a ship to carry her back to the St. John River. This trip lasted 6 months. The ship's commander sucked. His name was Captain Bailey. And she's just like, this is a fairly urgent trip we're on. I'm Action Jacqueline. Like, can we get back there really quickly? My husband's kind of in trouble. And Captain Bailey was like, yeah, sure. But first I'm going to stop on the Grand Banks to fish. What? So anyway, eventually, off of Cap La Sable, the vessel was stopped by d'Aulnay. Jacqueline hid inside and escaped detection, so she was not found. And the ship carried on to Boston for some reason. And it landed in Boston. Captain Bailey, like, what are you up to, Captain Bailey? Went to Boston, and then she sued him for unnecessary delay and also for not taking her to where she wanted to go, which was the St. John River, as he had agreed to take her. And then she won this settlement. She won 2,000 livres, I want to say is the currency, which would be like a lot of money back then. And in fact, it was enough money for her to hire 3 ships to evade the blockade d'Aulnay was maintaining at St. John Harbor, and she arrived home in the closing days of 1644. After all this stuff, she's like in her early 20s. Like, This is like pirate queen level shenanigans. Anyway, D'Aulnay, not taking no for an answer. He launched an unsuccessful attack at Fort Latour early in the new year. And then shortly afterwards, Charles Latour, so because France was mad at him, like remember Jacqueline had to like go through England and stuff, and that's where she got supplies from. So Latour was cut off from supplies from France. So his people needed food, they needed stuff, they needed supplies. So he decided to go to Boston to ask the English who were there to help him out. So he left. Action Jacqueline / Madame Latour is left in charge. Because who's more capable than her, obviously. But word spread that he had left the fort and that there was only 45 men left. And D'Aulnay found out about it. So he decided to attack again. So he arrived at the St. John River on April 13th with 200 men versus the 45 men plus Jacqueline who were inside the fortress. He sent an emissary carrying a summons to surrender, which I guess is just like a letter or a scroll being like, dude, just surrender. Jacqueline promptly dismissed this and she assumed command of the fort and was determined to fight if she must. Because she, no one is going to invade her fort, her husband's fort. There was a battle that raged for 3 days. She was like the military leader on her side. To last for 3 days when she had 45 men against 200 just kind of speaks to how good she was as a commander. The Dr. W.F. Ganong, who was a 20th, I think, century historian, described this as the most dramatic event in the history of New Brunswick. So casualties were relatively heavy on both sides, and the action continued over 4 days. And these 4 days were Easter weekend. Easter Sunday was the 4th day of the siege. And on that day, D'Aulnay's bombardment, his guns or cannons or whatever, managed to knock out a portion of the fort's parapet. So the part of the roof or the top upper wall area. And so he'd been able to land a force of men with 2 cannons on that parapet. So allegedly, a Swiss mercenary at the fort called Hans Vanier allowed the land force to creep up the walls of the fortification while its defenders were resting and holding Easter service. Not cool, bro. Invading, these are all Catholic people. It's French people. Anyway, so the noise of the storming of these people coming up the parapet alerted the garrison, and they rushed out of their, chapel to defend their post. And then, D'Aulnay's people were, in the fortress. So there's, hand-to-hand combat. And, again, losses on both sides were heavy. They've been fighting for 4 days. Finally, D'Aulnay called off his men and said that, if she would surrender, he would be cool, and he wouldn't, everybody could stay on his team. He wouldn't, do anything punishy to anybody if she would just give up. And so her small squad was reduced by casualties. She started off with 45. I don't know how many are left. It's I feel 10 people. Anyway, so she was just yeah, bro, this is hopeless. And she ordered her men to surrender. She's okay, this is fine. We will capitulate. And then, we may never have a clear view of what happened next, but various accounts agree in general with the substance of what I'm about to tell you, which is that D'Aulnay was a fucking liar. He went back on his word, disregarded the terms of surrender and being gentlemanly and being cool with each other. And he ordered that all the people from Jacqueline's team be arrested. A gallows, a stage for hanging people on, was erected, and all of the soldiers captured were hanged except for one man whose name was André Bernard, who agreed to be the executioner of all the others. Jacqueline was forced to watch all these hangings with a rope around her own neck. She was not hanged, but she herself died 3 weeks later, age something 23. She died of what? Broken heart? Of being killed, being poisoned by D'Aulnay. I don't know that didn't happen. Anyway, she was a hero. She fought until the very end. He tricked her. D'Aulnay sucks. Jacqueline's amazing. So she was from France. She was from France, and she had spent 5 years in Acadia, in New France. But her position in the history of Canada is as an iconic heroine. My mother, who learned about her growing up in New Brunswick, I don't even know, 60 years ago, was Madame Latour. She's that was a cool person. She defended somewhere. She did something good. Presumably people in New Brunswick still know her name. She was the first European woman to have lived, made a home, and raised a family in New Brunswick, is part of her significance. To quote one of the sources I read, neither the perils of the sea, the dangers of war, nor the horrors of a long siege could still her courage. Hell yeah, like she's amazing. Like, here truly was the most remarkable woman in Acadia's early history. And so the Acadians is a cultural group of people that sort of developed. The longer French people from France were living in East Coast Canada, like they developed their own cultural identity as the Acadians. And so she is sometimes seen as a heroine of the Acadians. So Fort Latour, the fort itself was destroyed at an unknown date in the 17th or early 18th century. It has been rebuilt as sort of like a living museum that you can visit in St. John, New Brunswick. And it was designated a National Historic Site of Canada in 1923. And when you look up about it, or when I looked up about it, in the last couple of years, there was a production of Macbeth, like the Shakespeare play, on site in Fort Latour, which the people who were putting on the production were saying part of it is just like the history of this place, like the murder and death that happened here, the like amazing, iconic woman leader, like that has reverberations with the story of Macbeth. I think it would be so cool to have seen that play done there. Anyway, that is the saga of Madame Latour, aka, to me, Action Jacquelin. There's not a Canadian Heritage Minute of her, as far as I know. She's not on a stamp, but she is commemorated clearly as a heroine of New Brunswick people that know about her. I think that in terms of a Canadian cultural identity, like this is the country we live in now, for better or worse, was founded on the genocide of the Indigenous people, obviously. And the people who came over here from Europe, mostly British and or French people. And the people who came here and could like survive and thrive were people like, it's cold in winter, like it's snowy here. Like you need to have some real fortitude to make a go of it in this country if you're not from here, if you're not used to these conditions. Jacquelin, I think, is a real Canadian heroine in that way. Like she just like whatever was thrown at her, she took it, she dealt with it, she turned it around, she like won so many things. Like she was convincing, she was badass, and she never stopped fighting until she was lied to. But she also was kind of like, we're never going to win. Like, let's just see what I can figure out from my guys. And she had to watch them all be killed. Anyway, it's a tragedy. It's also an exciting story because in terms of the history of Eastern Nova Scotia, so in Eastern Canada, so in Nova Scotia, Henry Longfellow wrote a poem called Evangeline, which is about an Acadian woman, and she sort of like had a lover. And anyway, it's like a tragic love story. And it's kind of like there's a statue of Evangeline. I think it's at Port Royal in Nova Scotia, and she's kind of like remembered as this heroine of the Acadians, as she should be. Like it's an iconic fictional character from a poem about a woman who was kind of sad, bad things happened to her. Madame Latour, like this is a woman who there should be statues of. She should be on a stamp, frankly. Like I think, I love the story of her. I love the way that she stepped up. I love that there are women like this in Canadian history, and there are women like this in Canada right now. And I hope that we're all going to vote for anyone except for goddamn Pierre in this election that's coming up. Anyway, these are the Canadian Heritage Minutes spin-off podcast. My name is Anne Foster. On Wednesday, there's going to be a new episode of Vulgar History, the main podcast that I do. But I keep finding iconic women from Canadian history, and I need to tell you about them because I'm excited about Canadian history for maybe the first time in my life. And this is startling to me, but exciting and interesting. And anyway, elbows up, tits out, hands on, and I'll talk to you all next time. Vulgar History is researched, written, and hosted by Anne Foster. That's me. The editor is Christina Lumagi. Theme music is by the Severn Duo. The Vulgar History Show image is by Deborah Wong. Transcripts are written by Aveline Malik.
I'm Amy Nicholson, the film critic for the LA Times.
And I'm Paul Scheer, an actor, writer, and director. You might know me from The League, Veep, or my non-eligible for Academy Award role in Twisters.
We love movies, and we come at them from different perspectives.
Yeah, like Amy thinks that, Joe Pesci was miscast in Goodfellas, and I don't.
He's too old. Let's not forget that Paul thinks that Dune 2 is overrated.
It is.
Anyway, Despite this, we come together to host Unspooled, a podcast where we talk about good movies, critical hits,
fan favorites, must-sees, and in case you missed them.
We're talking Parasite to Home Alone.
From Grease to The Dark Knight.
We've done deep dives on popcorn flicks. We've talked about why Independence Day deserves a second look.
And we've talked about horror movies, some that you've never even heard of, like Ganja and Hess.
So if you love movies like we do, come along on our cinematic adventure.
Listen to Unspooled wherever you get your podcasts.
And don't forget to hit the follow button.
What's up, fellow TV watchers? It's Brian from The Core Podcast, where we cover all things Apple TV+. We are wrapping up our recaps of Emmy favorite Severance, but 2025 on Apple TV Plus is just getting started. In April and May, The Core is recapping Seth Rogen's new Hollywood satire, The Studio, and Jon Hamm's dark comedy, Your Friends and Neighbors. We'll also be recapping the first 2 seasons of Apple's sci-fi thriller, Foundation, heading into the 3rd season of that later this year. Search for The Core, all things Apple TV Plus, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.
Hello, I am Kristen Russo.
And I am Jenny Owen Youngs.
We are the hosts of Buffering the Vampire Slayer once more with Spoilers, a rewatch podcast covering all 144 episodes of, you guessed it, Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
We are here to humbly invite you to join us for our 5th Buffy prom, which, if you can believe it, we are hosting at the actual Sunnydale High School. That's right. On April 4th and 5th, we will be descending upon the campus of Torrance High School, which was the filming location for Buffy's Sunnydale High, to dance the night away to 90s music in the iconic courtyard, to sip on punch right next to the Sunnydale High fountain, and to nerd out together in our prom best inside of the set of Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
All information and tickets can be found at bufferingcast.com/prom. Come join us.
And transcripts of recent episodes at vulgarhistory.com.